A fully complete explanation of how to use the business rule system is going to have to be an advanced video that I do. But right now I'm going to do like just a bare minimum call to business rules. So over here we have call rules, and I'm going to put that pretty close to the top of my program. And when you look at it, you're going to have to choose a policy. And you can see there are no policies right now to choose from. So to be able to choose a policy, what you have to do is run the utility called the BizTalk Rule Composer. And we look over here, look for the composer, Business Rule Composer. And since this is the first time I've used this tool since I've installed BizTalk 2006 R2, I have to connect here. It probably will not prompt me for that next time. Okay, and I just resized the screen so it would fit on the video. So when you want to call the policy, well, first of all we have to create a policy. We'll say add new policy, and we'll call this PO trace policy. And I want to decide whether or not I want to turn on tracing and what kind of tracing I want to use and, and stuff like that. So usually what you do is you pass an XML file to the business rule engine. So that means we're going to have to go back to our schemas and add yet another schema. Okay, so back to Solution Explorer, go to our PO schemas, and if I were building a big system, what I would do is I would create probably a standard trace message, and I would put it in a common schemas library. Okay, but right now I'm just going to say add new item, and we're going to pick a schema. Okay, and then we're going to call this I'm in the habit of putting SCH on a lot of my schemas, but I've noticed I haven't really done that here, so I guess I shouldn't start that habit now. Let's call this PO trace. Is that what I called it in the business rule? PO trace policy, so let's just call it PO trace. First thing I do is I change the root to match the same name. Okay, then we're going to insert a couple of attributes. Such as trace on, which will be a Boolean yes no, a Boolean true false. Okay, then I want maybe the name of the trace file or the path to the trace file. So trace file path, that's a string. And in the future I'm going to implement something maybe I'm going to trace to a path, or maybe I'm going to trace to SQL. So I might have a different trace methodology, and that might be a string where we choose from a list. So we put a restriction here, and then we can say file or SQL or event log, something like that. And we could have 3 different places that we trace to. And the other question would be, is there anything that's going to affect our trace? So maybe we have a parm that says this is the development system versus production system. So let's call it environment. And let's do a drive by there. And let's give it the value of test, QA. Let's actually make these all caps. Test, QA, or prod. Okay, so now we built this schema. We need to build our project. Do we need to promote these fields? Yes. Let's make them at least distinguish fields. Okay, so we'll go to distinguish fields. Yes, add, and add. Okay, then we're going to go back and do our build. Okay, while that's being built, we're going to go back to our business rule composer, and now we're going to add our first rule. Add new rule. And the rule will be just something simple like, say, set trace parms. And then what we're going to need to do is add conditions and actions. And to do that, we need access to our XML schema. So here we're going to go to schemas, and I'm going to browse to the disk where that schema is. And it's going to be My Documents, Visual Studio 2005, projects, BizTalk intro, PO schemas, and then it should be PO trace. Okay, so now what you can do in the conditions is you can say, like, if this is true, if it's kind of like an if then, but there's no else. Okay, so I want to create a predicate. See, they have their own language here in the business rule system. So I want to say create a predicate where something is equal to something, and I'm going to say where environment is equal to the word test. Okay, and you don't put the quotes here. Then I want to do actions. I want to set, basically now I can just drag and drop. So I'm going to drag trace on, trace path, and trace methodology to the action. And then you see it says enter a value. So trace on, since it's Boolean, it's going to give you this little pick list, which is kind of nice. Trace path is going to have to be from my hard disk, and the trace path name is going to be that, with the slash on the end, yes. And then my methodology is going to be file. Let's see if we did that upper or lower case. So no, it was file, just the first letter, caps only. Okay, and then you could have another rule. Actually, we should have called this rule set trace params test. Now you notice you can't rename the rule once you've created it, which is another pain. Okay, so you can, this user interface just kind of lacks a lot of functions. So I'm going to do a copy paste. I'm going to paste the rule, and this time I'm going to call it test. And then I'm going to delete the original rule, and then I'm going to paste it again. Oh, didn't ask me to rename it that time. Okay, let's do it again. Copy, paste, and this time we'll call it prod, and we'll have a third one then called QA. And so they should all have the same layout. So here, if it's QA, then I want to do this set of rules. If it's prod, P-R-O-D, I want to do a different set of rules. So in production, I might turn trace default. And on test, I want trace true, and on QA, I want trace true. So that's my business policy. So now I'm going to save it, and then I have to publish it, and then you have to deploy it. Three-step process. Now what if you say, whoops, I made a mistake, and you come down here and you say, oh, on QA, the boss said that that should be false. So notice you come down here and the fields are different colors and you can't change it. So what do you do now? So you come back up here, you copy the version 1, you go back to the policy, and you paste the entire version. Okay, so now we have a copy, and it automatically bumps up the version number from 1.0 to 1.1. Then you're going to go to QA. Notice it's green here, whereas when we were here before, well, I guess it was green there too, but now you can't change it. But on the not saved one, you can come here and you can change it. So again, we have to save, publish, and then deploy. So save, publish, deploy. So now we have two policies with two different version numbers deployed. And if we go back to our orchestration, click the rules, we then click under this column, and you see PO trace policy. Now it doesn't give you the version numbers here because the orchestration will always use the highest version that's deployed every time it runs. And then here we would pass a parameter to the policy, but in our orchestration yet we don't have any parameters that match. So I'm just going to click OK for right now. So we're actually going to demonstrate two different concepts in this video on how you can get configuration settings. So first of all, before I call the business rule, I need to know if I'm on test, QA, or prod, right? So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to the Program Files Microsoft BizTalk server, And I'm actually going to show you also how you can do a config parm here. So if you search for your extensions, you're going to look for bts nt service.exe.config, and we're going to go to edit on that file. Now, since this is a new install, I don't have any application settings here. So in order to get it right, what I'm going to go to do is going to go look at some other program on my disk. Okay, so I found a configuration file here from like a Windows program, and we can put comments here like set BizTalk config parms. Okay, and then we're going to put a key that says environment, and the value is going to be the test system. And then we're going to copy just, I believe, the app settings here to the other file that I have open, which is the config. We already have a configuration parm, see? So now you put your app settings here. Now next time it'll be a lot easier. You just open this file, and if you want to add a new parm, you just copy the key. And as many keys as you create, every one of those will be a variable available to your application. And if you want to think ahead, you might also call this something like PO. Let's go back to BizTalk admin here. We call this the purchase order app, right? So here, to avoid any future conflicts, let's call this purchase order app dot environment. Okay, that way in the future, if we could have another system called the payroll application, and it could have a different environment setting on the same computer. Okay, so that's why we're doing it this way. Now I'm saving that to disk, and let me just show you what can happen if you mess this up, by the way. So like for instance, if you got rid of this tag right here, and then now if you go restart BizTalk, so you go to your host instance and do a restart, boom, it doesn't start. So it stopped, and then it doesn't start, and it says failed to start because the application configuration is incorrect. It says reinstall the application may fix the problem. You know, that's one of those hilarious messages. Okay, so it's not very clear. If you go to the event log, there's not a lot of information here either. So the whole problem is that you actually have invalid XML in your BizTalk nt service exe config file. So now I fix it, put the slash back there, go back to the host instance, and now I should be able to start it. So anytime you want to change any of the config variables in your nt config file here, you must start and stop your hosts. Otherwise it won't pick up the new variables. So now that we've set this variable in our config file, we need to grab it inside of our orchestration. And so at the top here, in the same chunk of code, actually I like to add a new expression here. So somewhere like maybe very beginning, I want to insert an expression shape. And I've already basically got some of the syntax here. So this is a chunk of code I copied from another program. So we're going to say some variable, which is going to be, say, v-environment equals, and you have to put a convert here. In my prior example that I copied this from, I was actually getting an integer. In this case, I'm getting a string. And then the variable, I say system.configuration.configurationsettings.appsettings.get, and then I pass it the name of my key. And my key, my key is right here, purchase order app environment. Okay. The only thing it looks like I need to do now is set this variable, or define the variable. So we're going to go to variables, right click new, paste name, and put the word string here. And that should be the word toString, not just string. So what this does, it grabs the environment from the config file and sets it in a variable. And now I want to use that variable to actually call the business rules. So before I call the business rules here, I'm going to insert a little shape And how do I build a message, right? Well, we learned before there's construct, transform, and message assignment. Okay, so I'm going to actually do a little bit of all. So here, what kind of message am I going to build? I'm going to build the message that we're going to send to the business rules. And as of yet, we have not defined that message in our orchestration. So we're going to say here new and message, we got to give it a name. MSG, I'm trying to remember what we called it. How about trace parms or something like that? Let's go back, look at our schema again. Our schema, we called it PO trace. Okay, so back to here, back to the view, back to the messages. So we'll call it the exact same thing, message PO trace. We click the message type and we pick the schema from a referenced assembly. We go to the PO schemas and we click on, and notice PO trace is not here. So we've discussed before that lots of times when you add a schema, you need to build the schema project first, then you have to come back to your orchestration and you have to drop and re-add the reference to the schemas. So we add PO schemas back. Okay, and now we were defining a message. The message type, schemas, select from referenced assembly, and then here we go to PO schemas and we click on PO trace. Okay, so now we need to build that message. So here in our construct, we're going to construct the PO trace message. We're going to create a dummy little map here called map dummy init PO trace. And I call it a dummy because we're going to pick a dummy message in, and we're going to pick PO trace here. And as you see in a minute, we did a dummy schema earlier. We did a dummy map. All I need to do is populate these fields with a null value or a blank value. So we'll put here, here, here. I don't really care what's on the left side at all, and I'm going to set my concatenate functoid to just be nothing. Okay, so this is going to build our trace record. Now somehow I have to get my environment variable in here. So we're going to close this. And we talked about this in a video a while back. We're going to add here the message construct shape, message assignment shape now. And here we're going to say message PO trace dot, and we're going to use our distinguished fields, environment equals V, and then we have a variable called V environment. So our map, this wouldn't work if we didn't do the map first, because if you try to set the value of a distinguished field and that distinguished field is empty in your XML, you'll get a interesting error. Okay, so now we need to put a little documentation on this. So let me slide over a little bit. So let's call this message PO trace. Transform, let's call it init trace, and this one let's call it set environment. And then if we want to be fancy, we could do a few other things here. So like here, this expression, we could say get config, and now this trace, the trace file name in a minute is going to actually come from the business rules, not, well, okay, the file name we still build, the path we're going to get from the business rules. So we do call it path here, not file name. Okay, we're about half done. I'm going to stop this video here, and we're just going to continue the same concepts in the next video.